Trump plays into the evangelical fears surrounding quote-unquote socialists, Muslims, women who dare to think for themselves, LGBTQ people, and foreigners. Donald Trump isn't their president. He's their daddy, second only to their God. And in certain instances, it kind of feels like he edges out their God. By and large, they vote the way they do because daddy tells them to. They respond to rhetoric, emotionalism, and sensationalism just like they do to their pastors and worship teams. There's every excuse in the book for the way that Trump behaves and the persona that he projects. I have seen over the last 4 years evangelicals whose devotion to Trump absolutely outweighs their devotion to their own religion.
Right. Welcome to Unbound,
A podcast for new atheists
and lifetime atheists,
ex-evangelicals.
truth seekers, and free thinkers.
There is life after faith.
And life here is good. It's time for a new perspective.
And a better conversation. I'm Spider.
And I'm Shelle, and it's time to get unbound.
You know, for all the effort that I make to not say this person's name, I'm going to be using it a lot tonight.
Ugh.
Doesn't make me happy, but at the same time, this is some messaging that needs to get out there, and it needs to get out there right now. I'm Spider.
And I'm Shelle.
And just so that we're clear, this is not a political podcast. Unbound does not really deal with politics that much, but in light of what's about to happen here, in light of what this election means and what it can mean for not just the next 4 years, but for literally generations.
Yeah.
I think that it is important that we put some information out there and just give you a frank picture of who Donald Trump is and why evangelicals love him so much. Evangelicals love this guy. And on the surface, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But hopefully, by the time we're done with this, you'll have a better understanding of why evangelicals flock to him the way that they do. Now, in recent months, there have been a number of articles out there that suggest that the tides are starting to turn in a different direction, and they really need to.
Yeah.
They really do. I think that there are people out there that are already opening their eyes to the truth of what's happening with our country and who this person is. But there are still plenty out there who either A, still support him, or B, are so flummoxed by why people actually do support him that I think it's important that we understand what the parallels are here between Donald Trump and the evangelical mindset, and particularly who their God is. I've talked about this a few times on the show in kind of a passing way, but I do believe that it's time to go into a little bit more detail about this.
Yeah.
And I'm not using this platform just a couple days before an election to try and sway people to vote in one way or another. That's not my purpose. My purpose is to bring about understanding, and that's what this entire podcast is about. The theme music that we use, I've only plugged this a couple of times, but I find it interesting that out of the 20 or so music beds that I was looking at when we decided to do this show, I settled on one that is called Meeting of the Minds by Tom Dice. And I don't know of a more appropriate concept that there is for this show, because this is what we are trying to deliver here, is a meeting of the minds sort of situation where you walk away from every episode understanding certain things just a little bit better about evangelicals, how they think, the reasons they do the things that they do. And I hope that by the end of the night tonight, you have a better idea of why they rally around Donald Trump. And some of the reasons are probably not very surprising, but some of them might be a little bit of an eye-opener. So as we go, especially if you're an evangelical and you're listening to this, I want you to keep an open mind about this. I want you to just absorb the information. Try not to emotionalize what you're hearing. Hear the words and ask yourself whether or not what we're saying makes sense. Because I feel like Donald Trump does a very, very good job of sneaking a lot of his garbage under the radar.
Right.
And there are reasons for that, and there are reasons why it works so well. So let's just get right into it tonight. Why do evangelicals love Donald Trump? On the surface, it seems like a bit of an enigma. I mean, let's think about who this guy is and how he lives and the things that he has portrayed to the public over the years, not just during the last 2 election cycles, but long before also. Let's even breeze past the whole grab him by the pussy thing. Let's just talk about the fact that he's had 3 wives, that he has had multiple affairs that he doesn't deny. He exhibits very, very un-Christ-like behavior. He is a rampant racist and xenophobe. He champions boorishness and bullying behaviors on a global scale. He's gone out of his way to make enemies of our friends around the globe, and that's another problem. His very immature management of his emotions and obvious narcissism and other destructive personality defects. So what is there to like about this guy, let alone rally around him like he's some kind of a god? Well, it really boils down to just a couple of things here. Evangelicals, whether they want to admit it or not, have a predisposition for racism, homophobia, and xenophobia. And Donald Trump has gone out of his way to show that he has these very same predispositions. He's done it in a number of ways, and we're just going to look briefly at a few, starting with the very beginning of his first term, where he decided that it would be a good idea to ban Muslims from the U.S. Simply because they're Muslims. Now, let me go on record. There are extremists in every religion. Just look at the Ku Klux Klan. Just look at any of the hate groups that are organized and run by evangelicals that show up on the Southern Poverty Law Center's list of hate groups.
Right.
The very notion of excluding an entire group of people based solely on their religion is a very anti-American concept.
Right.
And I'll also put this out there. There is a qualitative difference between your average Muslim who is just trying to live their life by the rules of Islam and those who hold these very extremist ideals, those who want jihad, those who want Sharia law right here in the United States. There's a big difference between these groups of people. So just saying you can't come here because this is what you believe on a spiritual level is ridiculous. Let's talk about his exclusion of transgender people from military service.
Yeah.
Let's talk about encouraging civil unrest on racial lines. I personally don't understand how, after that first debate, he still has as much support as he has with the whole stand back and stand by thing.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that statement all by itself should tell you everything that you need to know about what he thinks about white supremacy in America. He was posed the question directly and succinctly, will you right now denounce white supremacy? And he wouldn't do it. What does that tell us about him?
Right.
Well, it tells us that this is okay with him. But here's the thing. It's okay with a lot of evangelicals too. Yeah. Now, most of my comments tonight are coming from an article from NBCnews.com. This is one of the longest titles for a blog post I've ever seen. The title of the post is White Evangelicals Love Trump and Aren't Confused About Why. No one should be. I'm going to start by reading a kind of lengthy quote from this article, and then I'm going to give some of my own observations on this. From the article, evangelicals in religious terminology believe that Jesus Christ is the savior of humanity. They have a long history in America and include a number of different groups, including Baptists, Pentecostals, Methodists, and non-denominational churches. After the schism among the Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians in the 1850s over slavery, conservative denominations like the Southern Baptists, who defended slavery through their readings of Scripture, came into being. Evangelical denominations formed from these splits in the South were usually comprised of people who had made money from slavery or supported it. After the Civil War, many were more likely to have supported the Ku Klux Klan and approved of or participated in lynching. The burning cross of the KKK, for instance, was a symbol of white Christian supremacy, designed both to put fear into the hearts of African Americans and to highlight the supposed Christian righteousness of the terrorist act. Billy Graham. Now, again, I've said that I have mixed feelings about Billy Graham. Very, very mixed feelings. But in response to a lot of this, Billy Graham once said that the only cure for racism is for the nation to, quote, turn to God. But let's take a quick look at what that really means. This is the same God that divided nations and peoples who were attempting to come together and know him better. At the Tower of Babel, the same God created division among ethnic and racial lines, confusing their languages and guaranteeing that people would never be able to openly trust or dialogue with each other. That's right there in Genesis 11. This schism took place early in what the Bible chronicles as human history, even though it doesn't even come close to the truth, and sends the clear message that Yahweh's agenda is one of division, not union. This has been the message from the book of Genesis forward. Pretty early on in the narrative, Genesis 11, and you're already seeing what Yahweh thinks about the whole concept of all men are created equal. Once again from the article, during the civil rights movement, many white evangelicals outright opposed Martin Luther King Jr. Evangelicalism became synonymous with being born again, and with the rise of the moral majority in the late 1970s, they began to seek not only moral, but political power. Can we say Sharia law? Okay. And just one quick aside, since I just brought up abortion. Let's just make one thing perfectly clear. Regardless of what happens with Roe v. Wade, regardless of what this new fascist Supreme Court regime decides to do with these things that protect women's rights,
Right.
regardless of any of that, I'm speaking directly to evangelicals and those who call themselves pro-life. What's your plan for the kids that are born? What's your plan for giving them a life? Because if you do not have a game plan for what happens after that child is born, you are not pro-life.
Nope.
You are pro-birth. You are pro-controlling a woman's body. You are pro-sticking your nose in places where it doesn't belong. And you are pro-poverty. You are all for just the lowest common denominator when it comes to quality of life. Because if you don't care how these people live once they're born, you cannot say that you are pro-life.
No.
You are pro-birth and you are pro-controlling women, period.
You're also pro-death of women from unsafe abortions, because the only thing that overturning Roe v. Wade will do is prevent safe abortions.
Right. It'll go underground again. We'll be back to coat hangers and that sort of thing. And the other thing is that you'll be killing scores of women who have problematic pregnancies, who now can't get an abortion when they
Right.
need it. Okay? I've never been a major fan of abortion as birth control, but I also know it's none of my business. It just is not any of my business. I cannot tell another person what she can or cannot do with her own body. That's just the bottom line. I may not like the decisions that are made when it comes to abortion in certain circumstances, but you know what? I also know that there are a lot of women out there who just can't deal with the entire process of having a baby, let alone being a parent after.
Right.
So what kind of life is that child going to have? I don't care if everything is going well with the pregnancy. I don't care if all of the statistics line up and say that this fetus that's growing inside this person has a good chance of being viable, has a good chance of being healthy. Well, maybe physically healthy, but what about the rest of its life? What about giving this child, when it is born, a healthy life? There are a lot of women out there that know what their limitations are.
Right.
And you know what? Mistakes happen. We do things on the spur of the moment. We do things in the heat of the moment. Don't think about them that much. I am not a huge fan of the birth control aspect of this, but I'm less of a fan of bringing people into this world that are going to be abused, that are going to be neglected, that are not going to be given a life once they are born.
Right.
To me, it's kind of a double-edged sword. I don't like the idea, but I like the idea of someone having a miserable life and possibly dying at the hands of their parents when they're very young, even less.
Right.
So there is that. Now, also from the NBC News article, Ronald Reagan, who also counted evangelicals among his most vociferous supporters, started his presidential campaign on the platform of states' rights from Philadelphia, Mississippi, where Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman were murdered by several Klansmen with the participation of local law enforcement in 1964, while attempting to register African Americans to vote. Decades later, the Reverend Jerry Falwell, oh, don't I love that guy, The evangelical leader opposed sanctions on South Africa's apartheid regime and insulted Bishop Desmond Tutu, a Nobel Prize winner, as a, quote, phony. Republicans and conservatives have been laying the foundations for a Trump presidency for years, particularly on the platform of racism. When Barack Obama was elected, it was Franklin Graham, son of Billy Graham, who fueled much of the birtherism associated with the Tea Party, aimed at vilifying Obama over issues they knew to be false. Barack Obama clearly held the credentials necessary to be considered for president, and to this day, they remain only two. You must be 35 years old, and you must be able to prove that you are a natural citizen born on U.S. soil. But because key figures in both politics and religion just said, that Obama was born in Africa, it simply became truth in the minds of people who have, for most of their lives, been taught to accept things as true without evidence if it comes from what they consider to be a credible source. Evangelicals have always hidden behind their racist tendencies, even to the point of speaking out against racist practices. Yes, there are plenty of Black and Hispanic ministers, even in large organizations like the Assemblies of God, but a surface acceptance of a person in his or her position says nothing about the underlying attitude that still produces a strong undercurrent in the way people think and behave. One thing that came to mind for me as I was putting my notes together with this was a conversation that I had. Well, not really a conversation. It was more of a comment that I smartly held my tongue on during the conversation back when I was a teenager. It was either before or after a youth group meeting. And I still don't remember or know why I was in the car with these people, considering that they lived in the exact opposite direction of where I lived. They weren't bringing me home. I don't know what the whole thing was. But I do remember this person's mother. One of my youth group friends was in the car with us, and his parents were up front. And you want to talk about the Ozzie and Harriet stereotype. These people were it. They were about as 1950s Americana as they came in 1986 or 87, okay? But I can remember hearing her refer to a family in our church as some of the, quote, finest colored people that I've ever met. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, that word has kind of been a pejorative for a while, at least in certain contexts. You still have the NAACP, and they still use that term. But in certain contexts, and especially if you're white, it's been a pejorative for a while.
Yeah.
And I'm listening to this, and the one thing that came to mind for me when she said it, there was an old episode of Happy Days where Richie decides he's going to refer to somebody as colored in front of, I think the character's name was Arnold, whoever Pat Morita played on that show. And I thought that it was interesting that he used that kind of a term with someone who was also a minority. And Arnold looks at him and says, really? What color? So that was what I was thinking of. That was precisely what I was thinking when this person said that. It's like, colored? What color are they? Well, I already knew what color they were because they went to our church. But, talk about a backhanded compliment. That to me, it seared into me, and I wanted to say something about it. But I was raised in a time, and I don't see this very much in my own life. I don't see it very much in the work that I do. But I was raised in a time that basically dictated that when adults spoke, you at least respected them to their face.
Yeah.
And I didn't agree with her. I didn't disagree with her. I didn't say anything. I just let the conversation continue to flow. But it stuck with me. And I remember talking to my youth pastor about it. And to this day, I don't know what his actual thoughts and feelings were about it. But I remember him saying to me words to the effect of different people express themselves in different ways. She didn't mean anything by it. And I said, you know what? I agree. I agree that she didn't mean anything by it. I know that she was basically just trying to say something nice about these people. But there are better ways to say it. And he agreed. He definitely agreed. But he's like, you're going to run into, once you're in the ministry, you're going to run into a lot of different people with a lot of different attitudes. And the best thing that you can do, the best thing that you can hope for, is that what you say from the pulpit sticks. So if this is something that's a hot button issue for you, if it's something that bothers you, then address it from the place where you're going to get the most play out of it.
Right.
Address it in your sermons, address it in the way that you manage your own ministry, but don't confront people. And so, I mean, I already had that in my head. Otherwise, I would have said something. But here's the thing. I was riding in her car. It was her and her husband that were up in there and up in the front seat. And I just, at that moment, didn't feel like it would be prudent to get into a discussion of why it's a bad idea to dredge up old pejoratives
Right.
when you're complimenting someone.
Yeah.
I'll also go on record saying that I didn't get a whole lot of examples of this sort of thing. The 80s were a different time, and there was less tolerance for a lot of things. There was less tolerance for people who were different.
Oh, yeah.
But we did have enough of a quorum of African American and Hispanic people that went to that church. The Hispanic population was actually a little bit larger. But I remember having some great conversations and great times with this one guy in the youth group who, I mean, he kind of perpetuated some of this stuff. He would make racial type jokes about certain things. And I can remember one summer we were all at youth camp, and there were like 2 or 3 other African American campers who, for whatever reason, came down with a pretty bad case of heat stroke. And it was just these few kids.
Wow.
And I think they were all the same family too. So it was probably a genetic thing. But I can remember this kid from our youth group. I said something about it, and he very tongue-in-cheek said, well, you know what? This is your fault. You kept us out in the sun too damn long. So there was stuff that came from both sides. But to me, for a person of color to say something like that, it tells me that the thinking even gets in when you're part of that target group. That kind of thinking still gets in there. So that little ha-ha self-denigrating remark does say a lot about what this person learned as an evangelical. I believe that wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
I think that it came from that more than anything else. But I also understood that that was his personality, that he wasn't making a statement, that he wasn't really denigrating anything. But that's the problem with the brand of racism that permeates, especially white America.
Right.
And most of us, and I'm going to go right on record with this too, most, if not all, white people are at least somewhat racist. It's not by choice. It is by conditioning. It's by what we learn and what we see. It's by being taught at the hands of other people who hold these ideals. And Jane Elliott is a big proponent of this particular idea. I'm paraphrasing here, and I think that I might have mentioned this before on the show. But one of the things that she has said over the years is that if you graduate high school in America, if you are white and graduate high school in America and have not been turned into a racist, then your social studies teachers have not done their job. Because of the slant that's put on history, because of the way that certain things are presented. Let's talk about Christopher Columbus. Okay? Let's talk about the way that that story is portrayed and what actually happened. Let's talk about how they try to truncate slavery into this small piece of history, when in reality it was about 400 years worth of this shit.
Yeah.
Okay. But the way that it's framed in school, do they tell you this? I don't remember being told that it went on for that long.
No.
I remember it being framed in a way that it just sort of cropped up around the Civil War, and the Civil War was about that, and then it just sort of dissipated after that. That the slaves were freed, and everything started getting better for black people in America. Oh, no. They still haven't. They still have not. You see, now, instead of having them out in the fields and picking cotton on a plantation, now we round them up and we put them in prison. And we put them to work from prison. It's the new slavery.
Yeah.
We put them in prison. We put them to work. We don't pay them jack Q shit. That's what this has now morphed into. So, no, I'm sorry. This is still a problem in America. And that's where the 400 years comes from. Because there wasn't a start and stop to this. There was where it started and where it is right now.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. Now, evangelicals have given plenty of lip service over the years, especially when the White House is under Democratic control. But get someone who thinks like them in the Oval Office, and their true colors really do begin to shine. Now, under Bill Clinton, there were a number of race equality initiatives that were spearheaded by evangelical groups, particularly the racial reconciliation movements of the 1990s. But these quote-unquote efforts have yet to bring about any significant changes, and there are many evangelicals, particularly in the South and predominantly rural states, who have found sanctuary for their own racist views in simply agreeing with Donald Trump and other conservative leaders who have been empowered to speak out more about their own racist leanings. Just to prove how disconnected evangelicals really are from their own statements about atoning for the sin of racism, let's look at the 2019 Southern Baptist Annual Convention. The proceedings were opened with a gavel owned by John A. Brodus, a slaveholder, white supremacist, and the founder of their seminary. Let that sink in. This is the person who founded their seminary, and he was a white supremacist. Another quote from the article: Trump does not judge people by the color of their skin, but whether or not they support him. And there are those that believe that this equates with Trump being, quote unquote, colorblind, which is in and of itself an insult to all non-white races. Another term that I absolutely loathe and despise is when someone looks at a person of color and says, I don't see color when I look at you. You know what that means? Here's what they're actually saying. I choose to see what I want to see about you and forgive that you're different.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what it's saying. If we choose to see someone for who and what they are, we have to throw out any expectation of them conforming to something comfortable for us to deal with, even in our own minds. Ask yourself, if someone's skin color elicits a thought like, I don't see color, what are you really saying? I accept every part of you that makes me comfortable and choose to ignore the things that make me uncomfortable? Well, yeah, that's pretty much it. That right there is not how any healthy relationship works. And it's not a healthy way of looking at other people. Another thing that I found interesting researching this was that a majority of white evangelicals, this didn't surprise me, but a majority of white evangelicals supported the Muslim ban. And we've talked at length on this show about how they use fear to motivate and to get you to think the way that they do. So they spin this particular line with a lot of propaganda. They shine the spotlight on extremism and neglect to mention that for every nutter out there putting on a bomb belt and running into a public place, there are multiplied thousands of Muslims that simply want to live their lives the way that they believe their God would be happy with.
Right.
What's the difference between that and Christianity? You know, not every evangelical supports the Klan. Not every evangelical supports all of these hate groups, and believe me, there are a lot of hate groups that fall under the cover of evangelical. It has really nothing to do with what the religion is. All religions have extremists.
Yeah.
So, no, it doesn't surprise me that most white evangelicals supported the Muslim ban, and it doesn't surprise me how they've propagandized this over the years. You see, long before Trump was president, we were being indoctrinated to this. All of these thoughts were being put in our heads. And of course, when we think about Muslims in America, what's one of the first things that we think about? We think about 9/11.
Yeah.
Okay. But again, that was an extremist act. And there were multiple, mostly Western, but there were multiple Muslim groups that immediately stood up and said, yeah, no, this isn't us. Right. And it's true. Just like what you see in an evangelical extremist is not average. You know, there are a lot of misguided people out there that are at least thankfully sitting there minding their own business and just waiting for the next church service to start. So that's the vast majority of your evangelicals out there too. Most of them are going to go to church. They're going to sit in their pew. They're going to take out their nice Bible with their leather case once a week, and then they're going to put it away until next Sunday and never look at it again. But that's the average. Then you've got groups like the American Family Association that have made it their business for years to propagandize everything in pop culture, everything that they don't like about society in general.
Yeah.
I've mentioned this group on the show before, and you want to talk about a group that seethes with hate. It's the American Family Association, and there are plenty others that are like them too. Evangelicals are the least likely to accept or support the entry of refugees into this country. This, to me, not only does it go directly against anything that Jesus said about when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? It just goes against what we are as a country.
Right.
Because America is supposed to be a melting pot. We're not supposed to have our own designated, specified culture. We are supposed to be an eclectic group of people that have come together for a common purpose, and that purpose is to be free and to exercise our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Right.
That's foundational to the doctrine of this American experiment. So, to me, it's very problematic that evangelicals don't want anyone to immigrate here. There's a lot of propaganda that goes on around this, and I will readily admit that there are a few negatives to just letting anybody in.
Well, yeah.
But at the same time, I also understand that diversity is what defines us as a country. I also understand that diversity is not something that your average evangelical likes very much. Right. I also understand that diversity is not something that Yahweh likes very much. Just look at the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
Diversity at the Tower of Babel was used as a punishment. It was not done to enhance the way that we interact with each other. It was done to divide and separate. So, right back to the very first book in the Bible, we see Yahweh telling us that diversity is bad. Yeah. Diversity is something that I'm using to punish these people because they were just a little bit too unified for my taste. Now, I mentioned earlier, white evangelicals, by and large, don't see an issue with white supremacy either. When posed the question, they'll say, when people are listening, and when you've got them face to face, they'll denounce it. But then they'll go right back to venerating their Middle Eastern savior, who is enigmatically Caucasian with blue eyes and surrounded by a posse of European blokes with names like James and Peter. And yes, these are European translations of difficult ethnic names, but this is the Bible that evangelicals read, and most never give the first thought to why their Middle Eastern savior is white, or what people with names like Mary, Joseph, Elizabeth, and Timothy were doing puttering around Palestine. Their image of Jesus, and this is the important part, forget what the quote-unquote original texts have to say. Forget about the names that you see in the original texts. The image of Jesus, and his portrayal in the English Bible, the only language that they're likely to ever read, study, or attempt to understand, is a recipe for white supremacy. I'm going to go on record again. This is still an issue for me. I've had to do a lot of unlearning, and there's still plenty of stinking thinking ferreting around in my brain, and I catch it. Most of the time, I catch it. Sometimes I have to be told.
Yeah.
But most of the time, I catch it. And when I say something that's insensitive and I'm called on it, my first reaction is not to defend. It is to apologize. Because this is the way that I've been taught to think. How can I, and I've had this conversation with people before. They understand that I'm not trying to offend. Right. So my first question is always, when I present this opinion next time, what's a better way of going about it? What should I be saying here? Right. Because I've been conditioned to think about this from a specific angle, from a specific perspective. But you know what? I'd much rather learn what yours is. And I'd much rather be able to approach this from the standpoint of equality, from the standpoint of respect. And if you felt disrespected, now, not even if is a terrible word in an apology. Yeah. I am sorry that I disrespected you. Okay? Those words alone can really go a long way toward bridging gaps between people and their understanding of each other. When you're wrong, admit it. When you say something insensitive, admit it and apologize. And do your best to understand where that other person is coming from. Do your best to understand what it was that offended them. And don't make the mistake of thinking that they're being overreactive or that they're too sensitive. No. 400 years of oppression. They have the right to be a little bit miffed. Mm. They have the right to be offended. They have the right to tell you, no, that's not right. And when they do, listen. Right. You don't have to be right all the time. You can fuck up once in a while. You can say things that are insensitive once in a while. But when you're called on it, throw your ego out the door and have a dialogue. It's that simple. Now, moving ahead just a little bit here, some other stuff that I gleaned from a couple of the articles that I read in prep for this. Much of Trump's appeal comes from and is fueled by messaging of decline and destruction, which fits snugly into the evangelical mindset of the end times. So we've done an episode on that, the whole rapture junkies, end times hysteria. Many evangelicals believe that we've been living in the end times for decades. I mean, do you remember the t-shirts? Jesus, the choice of the last generation?
Yeah.
And all of that, and then 88 Reasons and all of that craziness.
Yeah.
Going directly back to Donald Trump. When Trump used the term American carnage in his inaugural address, evangelicals listened. They too believed that America is in decline. Their imagined powerlessness and the need for a strong authoritarian leader to protect them is at the root of their racial and social animus. And that last bit was another quote from the same article. Trump plays into the evangelical fears surrounding quote unquote socialists, Muslims, women who dare to think for themselves, LGBTQ people, and foreigners. Their attachment to childlike faith makes them childlike in how they look to their leaders. Donald Trump isn't their president. He's their daddy, second only to their God. And in certain instances, it kind of feels like he edges out their God.
Yeah.
And just the unyielding devotion that they have for this guy. I have seen over the last 4 years evangelicals whose devotion to Trump absolutely outweighs their devotion to their own religion.
Right.
And the way that they respond to him and the way that they talk him up and the excuses that they make for him. I mean, you don't hear people making excuses for the Tower of Babel.
No.
But there's every excuse in the book for the way that Trump behaves and the persona that he projects. When they vote, evangelicals don't vote based on any kind of educated conclusion. By and large, they vote the way they do because daddy tells them to. They respond to rhetoric, emotionalism, and sensationalism just like they do to their pastors and worship teams. It sounds good. It makes them feel good. It gets them excited and pumped up. It raises just the right amount and kind of energy, and they run with it. I'll be the first to admit, I feel like Donald Trump is a very charismatic dude. Very charismatic. And I also understand why he appeals to some of the demos that he appeals to. Because a lot of the people who support him fall into a few categories. They're either, and this is not a slight on anyone, this is just the way that it is, okay? He appeals to people who a lot of times are either uneducated or undereducated. And by undereducated, I mean high school or less, often less. He appeals to people who live in areas that are not densely populated, rural areas that don't see the effects on the rest of us that his policies have had, because their life basically still looks like business as usual. So they assume that he's doing a good job, and that charisma pumps them up. It gets them excited. Yeah. So of course, I mean, let's think about Amway. Let's think about the energy that was raised in those meetings and the enthusiasm that was prevalent. Now, you go to a Trump rally. I've watched footage from Trump rallies that felt like Amway rallies.
They looked like them.
They did, and they sounded like them. And all of the stuff that they do to fluff up the messaging in an Amway rally exists at a Trump rally. So it doesn't surprise me one bit. And how many evangelicals are in MLMs?
Oh, gosh.
Particularly
Like,
Amway.
A lot.
Yeah. So you know what? Trump may not be as successful as he tries to make himself out to be, but he does understand marketing.
Oh, yeah.
He totally understands marketing, and he knows that if he's going to reach these sorts of people, then he's going to have to go about it this particular way. Yeah. And he does. And he does it to the nth degree. A majority of evangelicals consider Trump to be moral and godly. Think about that. Now, and I'm going to give a bunch of examples here. Okay. They look at him as moral and godly, but they're equating him with a God who has done some pretty nasty shit. Let's start with the fact that evangelicals worship a God who knows nothing about science. You want to know where all this COVID denying comes from? It comes from a lack of understanding of science. And you know what? The more I hear him talk about this, the more I see him tweeting about, don't be afraid of coronavirus. Don't let it ruin your life, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, you know what? You had some of the best doctors in the world looking after you, and you got some very experimental treatments that just so happen to work.
Yeah.
The rest of us don't get that.
No.
So yeah, we are going to be afraid of it, and we're going to keep masking up, and we're going to keep doing what we need to do to stay safe. Thank you very much. But their God knows nothing about science. Let's just look right at the book of Genesis, where the first thing that I see here is the verse about greater light and lesser light. So the greater light would be sunshine, and the lesser light would be the moon at night. Okay, there's a few problems here. Okay, number one, the greater light and lesser light are the same thing. The moon does not generate its own light. At night, we see the moon because the sun is reflecting, because it is reflecting light from the sun off of it. So that right there tells me that if this is the authoritative word of God, if all scripture is God-breathed, then this God knows nothing about astronomy. Let's talk about plants being present on Earth on day 3, but the sun not being present until day 4.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a little thing called photosynthesis that happens with plants. And this process and all the processes that give us the seasons of the year that are causing the leaves to fall off the trees right now, all of these things are conditioned on the existence and presence of sunlight. Okay? When you have a lot of sunlight, when you have more hours of light than you do of darkness during the day, everything's green. Everything blooms. When you have less light than darkness, the leaves start to change color, they fall from the trees, and the trees are bare for winter. This is the way that it goes. It's funny because this is something that, I don't know whether or not they went over it a whole lot in my science classes in junior high and high school. I will readily admit to not paying as close attention as I should have to science. But you got to understand, I was in the thick of this through most of that. So I learned what I had to learn, and I kind of threw most of it out.
Yeah.
Which is very sad because I'm sure that there was more to be learned. But it was only after I got into weed that I started understanding how plants work and why you need certain light cycles to get certain things to happen with plants. But there's a lot of people out there that don't understand that. There are a lot of people out there who think that we get fall because it gets colder.
Yeah.
No, we get fall because there's less light. And it really doesn't have anything to do with temperature. So, well, it has some, but it has very little to do with temperature. Those leaves are going to change and they're going to fall regardless of where they are. So there's that. Let's talk about the numerous refutations that there are of the flood ever having happened, just from the standpoint of anthropology, geology, and about a dozen other ologies that Aaron Ra likes to talk about in his videos. If you've never heard of Aaron Ra, then I would look him up on YouTube like as soon as you're done with this episode. Look up Aaron Ra, A-R-O-N, Ra, R-A. And I don't think that I have ever heard anyone explain this so well and so thoroughly. It's like, by the time you get done with one of these videos, how do you even begin to refute what he has to say? I mean, you've watched them too. So I've gone through a lot of his content. And let me tell you, if you've got someone who's really hardline on the side of this actually happened, have them watch these videos. They'll have a hard time sleeping that night.
Yeah.
Okay. And let's talk just for a second about the suggestion. It's not expressly said anywhere in the Bible, but it's definitely suggested over and over again that men shoot tiny babies into women's vaginas that grow inside the womb without any genetic contributions from the mother. Yeah. For the longest time, and you know what? It's a pretty contemporary thing that we even understand what the process is of making a baby aside from the obvious. Right. Okay? Because people have known what sex is for a long time, since day one. We've known how to make more people.
Right.
But it's really, it's kind of a contemporary thing that we really honestly, truly understand all of the processes that are involved. I've often wondered what explanation these people had when they produced a kid that looked more like the mother than the father. I mean,
I don't know.
How did they explain that? If all of the genetic information came from the father, and it's just a little teeny tiny baby that gets shot in there and grows up, then how come some kids look like their mothers? Did anyone ever bother to question that? I have no idea.
Don't know.
That's just a real thumbnail sketch of the science end of it. Let's talk about how the Bible advocates people owning other people as property and lays out a management structure for keeping slaves. That's in Exodus 21. If you don't believe me, just go read it right now. Yahweh, through his authoritative word, all scripture is God-breathed, okay? So let's forget that this was written by another person. We're supposed to believe that it was handed down by God himself. So Yahweh outright advocates slavery in the Old Testament. There is no possible way that you could skirt around this. Yahweh advocates and teaches you how to manage slavery. It's that simple. Let's talk about how Yahweh uses out and out murder to get shit done. Okay? His response to a lot of problems in the Old Testament is to either kill a bunch of people or put a contract out on a bunch of people. Okay? And here are just a couple of examples of how Yahweh uses mass murder in the Bible as a means of solving his own invented problems with people. Let's talk about the flood. I just touched on that a couple of seconds ago. Yahweh regretted making people. These are people that are made in his image and likeness. Mull that over for a sec. Okay? He saw the way that people were and regretted ever making them. So what does he do? He kills them all. Except for this one family that he decides is righteous, that then turns around and engages in incest and a bunch of other things that really, even by biblical standards, was not exactly the type of thing that was looked on as virtuous.
Right.
Let's talk about Passover and everything that surrounded that. The only reason why any of that shit happened was because Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart, removed Pharaoh's will from the equation, and used his control over one person's mind to bring all manner of calamity upon the people under his rule. God basically took over Pharaoh's head and would not let him see the other side, would not let him see any kind of counterpoint.
Right.
And then used that as an excuse to rain down frogs and to turn the water into blood and to send flies and locusts and famine. And then comes Passover, where now we're just flat out killing children.
Yeah.
This is who this God is. He orchestrated all of this. It wasn't Pharaoh's fault. It says right there in black and white that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. What this means, boys and girls, is that this is what this God wanted to do.
Right.
It was his plan all along, and no one was going to stand in his way, so he just took away this guy's will. So all of this was orchestrated, and it was put forth on purpose. This is the kind of masochistic deity that you think loves you. Let's talk about the parting of the Red Sea. Further judgment on a people controlled by a man whose will was circumvented and manipulated. Because what else would have caused Pharaoh to send out all of his soldiers to bring back the Israelites?
Right.
And there's other psychological games that are being played with Pharaoh at the same time, too. So all of this stuff is done for the express purpose of Yahweh being able to kill a bunch of people. That's all this was about. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, destroying an entire society because they liked sex and other perceived vices. And it's clear that God looks at certain people in the Bible and outright in the pages of the Bible calls them righteous. Let's talk about Solomon for starters here. Solomon is thought by God to be righteous, even though Solomon's own sexual drives went totally counter to what is supposed to be God's laid out plan for what a family is and what sexual morality is. But this person, with all of his wives and concubines, look it up, 1 Kings 11, is considered to be not only wise, but righteous. Then we have King David. who is referred to in a couple of different places, but predominantly in 1 Samuel 13, as a man after God's own heart. Well, this is a man whose uncontrolled lust for a woman caused him to have her husband slaughtered in battle so he could have her to himself. That happens in 2 Samuel 11. But that was fine because later David repented and wrote a song about it. You can read it in Psalm 51. So that, I guess, just made it all okay. And it ties in well with the whole concept of when you sin, just ask for forgiveness.
Yeah.
Going to get the good Lord to forgive a little sin, wipe the slate clean so we can dirty it again. Steve Taylor again, ladies and gentlemen. We're talking about a God who denigrates women for being women and calls them unclean because they menstruate. In other words, because their bodies work the way he fucking made them to work.
Right.
We're talking about a God who provides avenues for keeping women forever under the control of men. Just take a look at Ephesians 5. And let's talk about Paul's attitude toward sexuality and human sexual relations, where he refers in Romans 1 to the natural use of a woman. The natural use of a woman, like she's an object to be used and then disposed of when she can't have kids anymore. Is that pretty much it? And then, of course, there's the whole condemning homosexuality thing, which you see in Leviticus 18. Now, Trump has made statements and exhibited behaviors that fall in lockstep with all of the above. His vengeful nature, his misogynistic mindset, his need to be lauded and praised as a means of keeping his own ego in a place that's comfortable for him. All of these things mirror the actions and attitudes of the Hebrew Yahweh, right down to Trump's many statements about how much he cares about America and its people, while demonstrating absolutely nothing that begins to corroborate those claims. Once again, from the NBC News article, evangelicals in America are not simply a religious group. They are a political group inexorably linked to the Republican Party. Why do they love him so much? Well, number one, he's a mirror image of their God.
Yeah.
And we've shown how. But I also found this interesting. It's another little quote with a few thoughts thrown in. Trump delivered evangelicals from the shame of losing after 16 years of Democratic Party governance, which was still held back quite a bit by the presence of a Republican-led legislative branch. So they didn't have as much control as your average evangelical wants you to think they did. But here's the thing. Trump managed to convince these people that the suppression was bad enough that radical change was needed. Well, he didn't provide radical change. He just provided radicalism. And there's a big difference. And you know what? A lot of these people are going to back him again in 2020 to avoid losing again. So perhaps we should take evangelicals at their word when they say they will support Trump come hell or high water, rather than twisting ourselves into knots trying to figure out why. You see, to someone like me and to someone like a lot of people who are coming out of evangelical faith, the why is pretty obvious.
Right.
Tonight was more for the evangelicals, to get them to understand why they are so enamored of him. And I think that a lot of this slips under the radar. They don't think about the absolutely horrific things that their God has done.
No.
And subsequently, they don't see the horribleness in the things that Donald Trump does. So that really is it in a nutshell. So, of course, we're on the eve of an election, and a lot of people have already voted. There's been a lot of early voting already. So, again, my job here tonight is not to tell you how to vote or anything like that. My job tonight is to just open the door a little bit wider to your understanding of who this guy is and why he managed to get into the White House, how he managed to get into the White House, because it wasn't all Russian influence.
No.
There was a lot of evangelical influence. And again, a quote from the movie Jesus Camp, when evangelicals vote, they determine the election. Well, that may be less true this time around, but it's still a looming threat.
Right.
It's still problematic. There are still a lot of them out there that believe that this guy is second only to their God. And that is definitely a problem. But again, tonight my aim is not to tell you how to vote. My aim is to make it clear what you're voting for if you opt for 4 more years of Donald Trump. And if you're listening to this after the election, regardless of the outcome, keep your eyes open. Donald Trump has flung the door wide open for the kinds of thoughts, behaviors, and attitudes that far too many evangelicals embrace, and very little of it, if any, will move society in a forward or positive direction. To the evangelicals listening to this, I want to issue you a challenge. Regardless of how you vote or voted in this election, and regardless of its outcome, I challenge you to give yourself the opportunity to have an opinion of your own about all of this. I challenge you to stop lending deference to your pastor's opinions and those of other evangelical leaders, and let your rational mind have its say. Ask yourself if the actions of this president reflect your moral leanings. How much of it is okay with you, and how much of what Donald Trump does would really be embraced by your family, friends, and church members if you adopted even a small bit of it as your own? Would your behavior, opinions, and actions be considered morally, socially, or spiritually acceptable in the eyes of anyone you love or respect? Think for yourself on this one and weigh your answers against what you understand about the concepts of right and wrong. Not your pastor, not a Bronze Age collection of manuscripts, not a self-published book or a poorly produced movie. You. Because what you think matters. And I don't think for a second that you would say that Donald Trump, or those who think like, behave like, or support him, personifies anything decent, moral, praiseworthy, or of good report. If you truly believe that your faith is built upon tenets of love and compassion as you claim it to be, there is no possible way you can look at this individual and see anything that jives with anything you've been taught about either. Now to the truth seekers and freethinkers. We might be able to salvage some of the American experiment after all this, but even in a post-Trump America, evangelicals will proceed from a place where they have become more empowered and will continue using their voice to assert their will over everything, from who you love and who you marry to whether or not you're allowed to terminate your pregnancy based on spiritual, not anthropomorphic or scientific criteria. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. Now, more than ever, it is important that we, as rational, free thinkers, use our voices and keep compelling counter-arguments in front of those who see Trump and his policies as something good, moral, or beneficial to society. We need to work together to confront people with reality, force them to see the world they're creating for what it is, and start thinking less about nebulous spiritual concepts and more about the very real things that allow us to function as a society. We won't get there by allowing women's rights to be taken away. We won't get there by empowering white supremacists. We won't get there by letting the poor and minorities be marginalized and kept in their place. We'll get there by using our voices, both inside and outside of the voting booth, living by example and doing our level best to show those who support Trump and his ideologies that they are keeping all of us under bondage, and that it's time to get unbound. Get out there and vote. This is not a drill. Peace out. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Unbound. Show topics are chosen based on their timeliness, relevance, and social impact. Have suggestions for future topics? Email us at unbound.podcast.network@gmail.com with all your comments and feedback. Please don't forget to like, share, and throw a few 5-star ratings our way, and follow us on all major social platforms. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Links to our social pages, as well as a full list of cited sources in today's episode, are listed in the show notes, available at our website, getunbound.org. That's get-unbound.org. If you value this resource and would like to see it continue, please consider supporting us on Patreon at the link in the show description. And be sure to check for new updates every Sunday when we'll come together again and take one more step toward getting and staying unbound.